This is part 2 of organizational development, specifically looking at the 5th discipline, systems thinking. Systems thinking can be many things, but at its simplest, it's this idea of being able to, just as it sounds, look at entire systems. That might sound simple, but generally, like a fish swimming in water, we're sort of caught up in whatever system we are in, and it's hard for us to step aside and really look at what is going on and what we are a part of. This is why it's so hard for us to see the assumptions that we are making all the time. As thinking becomes more complex, we are able to step aside, so to speak, and view entire systems. Systems thinking is based on the natural world, the idea that in the natural world things occur in cycles and circles, and thus they are sustainable and they can support themselves, as opposed to a mechanized world where things are linear or hierarchical, which makes them fragile and they can break. They can burn themselves out when they come to the end of the line. Here are some basic systems thinking principles. Cause and effect are not closely related in time and space. So thinking about one thing causing another is really important in systems thinking, but it's not simple. Because systems thinking understands that things occur over long periods of time. So therefore, when we look at today's problems, they come from yesterday's solutions, but we might have forgotten that they come from yesterday's solutions because there was such a long delay in the system. Often behavior grows better before it gets worse. Again, having to do with this long cause and effect of things taking a long time before they really show up. Fast solutions are not a part of systems thinking. However, fail fast is. This is the concept that if we want to learn, go ahead and try something and give it an iteration and then improve upon it. Small changes can produce big results. So what we do in systems thinking is we look for leverage points. Often when we draw out a system and we draw different causes and effects loops, we see that there is a leverage point that if we just make the smallest change, everything could change. Therefore, systems thinking can mean high efficiency, using the smallest amount of energy to make the biggest difference. Both and thinking. Instead of thinking in duality, either or, thinking in both and, that we can have it all if we really look at things with a different consciousness. There is no blame. So this means we don't blame an individual when things go wrong. We don't always look for where the fault is. Instead, we look to the entire system that created the circumstances. Biomimicry, as mentioned in systems thinking, we look toward nature and imitating nature, because in nature, when everything is in balance, it's in a cycle or it's circular. And following from that, living systems are whole, and therefore they have a natural integrity. This list was adapted from Peter Senge. I mentioned causal loops or causal maps. In systems thinking, there's often talk of something called system archetypes, which are various patterns of phenomenon that can occur in the natural world or in businesses, and these are based on causal loops. On the screen are two very simple examples of causal loops. On the right, we could think of this as the heat in the room interacting with a thermostat. So factor 1 is the heat in the room. The heater comes on, it gets warmer and warmer in the room. That makes factor 2 kick in, which is the thermostat then shutting the heater off, and then the room begins to cool, keeping the room always at, let's say, a temperature of 72 degrees. So that is called a balancing loop for obvious reasons. And then on the left side is a reinforcing loop. We could say that factor 1 is the number of widgets that a company is making. So factor 1, the company begins to make a lot of widgets. Factor 2 is that customers like the widgets and they buy them. And so with factor 2, as customers buy more widgets, that makes the company make more widgets. And so it goes around and around. Buy more widgets, make more widgets. And that's called a reinforcing loop. In systems thinking, we take simple causal loops and we can examine them and look at them from a more complex perspective. So one level up of complexity is to add a delay. So in this particular model, we have a short-term strategy. Let's say that it is a company strategy to make more widgets, and there are short-term gains. The company experiences sales and profits from selling more widgets. So that's that upper loop, is a reinforcing loop. Buy more widgets, make more widgets. But the larger loop is what is going on underneath the surface that we cannot see, the long-term cost, or a delay of something that's going to happen in the future as a result of the short-term loop. So the delay might come when the company runs out of resources that it takes to make the widgets, or the widgets create some sort of health problem, and that's a long-term cost. And that creates a larger, let's say, balancing loop that brings an end to that reinforcement that's going out of control of making more widgets, buying more widgets. So that's a simple example, but these causal maps can become extremely complicated. But as I mentioned, there are a few particular archetypes that describe common phenomenon. And I want to show you one of those archetypes in particular. It's called the success to the successful, and it is particularly useful to think about in our field of education, and I think you'll see why when you watch this short video.
In this session, I will talk about the success to successful archetype. This structure is actually two reinforcing loops that interact in such a way that it causes one loop to grow and the other one to actually diminish. The situation is such that the resources provided on one side are responsible for the success on that side, and resources on the other side are responsible for the success on that side. Though if for some reason or another, one, either A or B, demonstrates more success than the other, because of the nature of the structure, it will then allocate more resources to whichever one of them is more successful. And because they're reinforcing loops, any little bit of additional resources ends up being amplified very readily, so that if B should demonstrate slightly more success than A, it will end up getting more resources and demonstrating more success than A, because the allocation of resources to A has been diminished. So the more success B demonstrates, the more resources it gets, and the fewer resources A gets, so its success declines. And this structure will cause things to become extremely lopsided very readily. This structure is sometimes called the self-fulfilling prophecy, where I think that Tina is smarter than Susie, so I spend more time coaching Tina, and therefore she performs better than Susie, so I've been proven correct, and I continue to coach Tina and not Susie, and Susie becomes a failure while Tina becomes a superstar because of all the coaching that she's been given. If I run this model, notice that the resources are allocated in such a way that B continues to demonstrate tremendous success, and A demonstrates no success any longer. They've been completely derailed. So the sad thing about it is, seldom is it ever realized ahead of time, and more often than not, it's not even realized after it happens. It's typically just assumed that one person or one group is less performant than another, and time isn't spent to investigate beneath the surface to realize that they are in fact victims of what's happening in the structure and the allocation. And we do that at times without even realizing that we've made that judgment, which is why I continue to say that we need to spend time to challenge the assumptions under which we operate. And much of the time that we spend, we operate in autopilot, not aware of the biases under which we actually decide to do things. So the approach for this structure is, when you see it happening, ask yourself, is there actually an underlying basis to what's happening? Is it really the group or the individual that's at fault, or are they being under-resourced in some way that's causing them to be less performant than the other group? So it's more often than not, it's a structural problem. Hope you found this informative.
So that is our quick introduction to systems thinking and to organizational development.